Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a brand new guest, and this is his second or third podcast appearance, apparently. And I've just realized that, Kevin, I should have asked you how to say your last name because I suspect you don't say it double O.
It's actually Oo. So
Ooh,
it's not a very common surname, but yeah,
hmm
it's just pronounced Oo.
thank you very much. So, Kevin Oo is my new
Yep.
guest today. He's joining the podcast to discuss a soon to be published study on the effects of lengthened partials on strength and hypertrophy of the chest specifically. Now, Kevin, before we get started, I always introduce my podcast guests, the brand new ones, with a question. And this is the question: who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
Okay. So my name is Kevin. I'm based in Malaysia. A men's physique athlete. I've been bodybuilding for give or take over a decade, maybe 12, 15 years. I really started lifting when I was like 17-ish, which is fairly late by all standards, but in Malaysia it's fairly young. And since then, I've been bitten by the iron bug, and I've been really interested in just how I can try my best to maximize my own potential and potentially even help some of my clients just achieve their best physiques. I'm a coach primarily. I've actually been coaching for about a decade, slightly over a decade. And I didn't really come from a research background initially, but I just like most guys who are in the evidence-based community, it came to a point where or I at least, wanted to maximize my gains. And I was like, look, there's a lot of things that people say that works. Some people say muscle confusion. Some people say that you have to do the bro split. Some guys tell you that you have to go high volume. Some guys tell you to do the low volume. So there was just a lot of questions that were in the air. And in an effort to seek for answers, I basically went down the route of doing a lot of my readings from back in like the early 2011s, 2012s, where I was reading up things from Lane Norton, Cliff Wilson, even the original strength nutrition pyramid from Helms. I don't remember what year that was, but yeah, I went down the bodybuilding.com route. So there was just a lot of interest in finding answers to questions that I had, and there's the more answers that we kind of looked into, the more questions that I had that could not be answered, and that's where eventually when I finished my law school and came back to do my full time coaching career. I just decided that look, I want to kind of look in behind the curtains a little bit more of what research is like rather than just reading the research. I want to kind of be able to at least do my small part in terms of contributing back to the good literatures that have helped me. And that's where we are at right now, where we just did our first pilot study. A full study should be sent for submission fairly soon. I'm hoping that passes review. And yeah, then we'll see where that takes off after that.
Very interesting career progression and interest progression as well. And I am very intrigued to talk to you since you've been in the game for so long as a coach, a bodybuilder, and now a researcher as well. I'm curious, is this the first study that you're going to have get published under your name?
Yes, so the pilot study is published under my name as the lead author. I think the full study, because I'm not living in a lab all the time, it's actually quite tiring to have to kind of bounce back and forth because the lab is like 20 minutes away from where my gym's based, because that's where the university is at, and that's where most of the research is being done. So I'm not really in the lab as often with my research partner. So I'm primarily helping out in terms of screening the participants, kind of going through some of the methodologies that's involved, and just basically writing up the discussion, analyzing the results, going back and forth on what the results basically mean, what more that we need to do, answering the reviewers, things of that kind. But yeah, so the pilot study was done when I was still in the university quite a bit. But nowadays, I'm not really in the lab as much anymore. I can go back and visit every once in a while, but the gym here is basically where all my attention is at.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I was just curious in the sense of, is this still one of your first papers, or is it already further down the line? Sounds like it's still
No, no.
basically one of the first. So
Yep.
congratulations.
Thank you. I think that it being the first paper is also partly because I'm not very experienced in this kind of things, like the high level stuff, like the statistical analysis that guys like Dr. Roberts, the entire data driven strength crew that's running, those are really high level stuff. Like even I myself being I would consider myself fairly novice in that department, where whenever you're digging into it, it can be quite heavy stuff that they're doing, which is pretty impressive in my books. Like some of this I have to actually discuss with even the good Dr. Eric Helms on what they truly mean and how they actually did it, and it's quite impressive from that front. So from my end, I'm fairly novice on this, and yes, this is our first paper, and I think that I often tell a lot of the guys that I speak to that I am more of a full-time coach, part-time researcher, because I like that side of the process, and I'm usually doing it in a way where I'm trying to find practical takeaways, because there are things that are very cool in terms of how it applies to us from a theoretical perspective, but there's not a lot of practical takeaways or something that's like, oh shit, this is something that I can use. So I'm really looking at all my papers that ever, if I'm ever involved in, as what does this apply to us? How does this apply to us in terms of practice?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I say it every time this comes up on the podcast, but that is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because I like to talk to researchers, but also to practitioners to tease out what practical takeaways we can actually apply as trainees, but also with our clients. So before we delve into the conversation on the study itself, I just want to remind the listeners and viewers, and also maybe say that this to them for the first time, because I might have some new listeners and viewers today. We've discussed lengthened partials on the podcast before on several episodes. The first one dates all the way back to 2022 when I interviewed Dr. Milo Wolf. And then the latest one was episode 183 when I talked to, at the time, PhD candidate Dorian Varovich. So this is one of many episodes, and we're going to add an extra piece to the puzzle, that is the effect that lengthened partials can have compared to full range of motion on hypertrophy and strength. And Kevin, you actually half answered my first question, because it sounds to me like you really wanted to bridge the gap between research and application, and pay a contribution to the science literature on this topic. I'm wondering if you have any other reasons why you specifically wanted to run a study on lengthened partials and full range of motion, or in other words, which other gaps were you trying to fill with this particular paper?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying that it is incredibly humbling to be able to at least contribute a little bit to really somebody who kicked off this lengthened partial study, which was with Milo Wolf. I've read his I'm pretty sure I've read most, if not all, of his papers on lengthened partials in pursuit of this study. But the real reason why we kind of looked into this area was because we realized that a lot of the studies are on biceps, triceps, hamstrings, calves, bicep, tricep, hamstring, calves, and quads, the rack fam specifically. And there wasn't a lot of studies that were done on the lats and the chest and the delts. As far as I can think of, I think Larson had one paper on the delts. There's a preprint by Jones. Wait, it might be a full paper that's been released. I'm not really sure right now. By Jones, that investigated it on the chest. When they were comparing basically a resistance matched exercise for the chest at the shortened and lengthened position, sometime in 2025, I think, that investigated the chest. And that's probably the few exercises or papers that studied on the delts and the chest. So we really wanted to kind of look into the chest a little bit more, because we realized that there wasn't really a lot of applicability in or studies that could be directly applied to the chest and say that, look, this answers that it applies to the chest. Now, mechanistically, obviously, to us at least, it made sense that if there were benefit or positive effects of lengthened bias training on, let's say, the rectum or triceps or biceps. Sarcomeres or sarcomeres. Therefore, if it applies to the chest, applies to the tricep, it should therefore apply to the chest as well. But we never really could make that leap without something conclusive. So we decided that, look, let's delve into this a little bit further and see whether that actually holds true when we compare it side by side with lengthen versus a full range of motion exercise. So that's basically where we are coming from initially. We understood that there were quite some difficulties measuring via ultrasound in the chest and the lats. That's just a natural part of the musculature that you're involved with. But we still wanted to attempt to see whether we could truly answer everything that, or at least try to introduce this concept so that more papers could be done in this area.
That makes perfect sense. And yeah, I had noticed that same gap. And it's, as you say, we can assume that it would be reasonable to assume that if something applies to a muscle, it will apply to others, but we won't know until we find out. And in this podcast, we are about to find out. And for the listeners and viewers, if you want to check out the full paper when it eventually comes out, the current title is "Does Lengthened Partial Always Beat Full ROM? Investigating the effects of full range of motion and lengthened partial range of motion on chest hypertrophy and strength." So the next question for you, Kevin, is this. Tell us more about the study. Talk us through the methods and the participants and all of the other aspects that it's important for us to understand to gain an insight into the conclusions.
Okay, so I'm gonna just go through very, very high point kind of stuff because I had to kind of re-go through the entire thing from a statistical standpoint and all that I don't think most of the viewers are gonna, frankly speaking, care too much. But the general idea was that we, instead of doing two separate groups, we decided to use a within participant design because we wanted to control for genetic factors, lifestyle factors, and we thought that, look, if we control that, we could have more data points that were a little bit more reliable. So we started with trying to look for, I think it was 20 odd participants, and we actually got, we screened through like 25, maybe 30 guys. We had 20 participants come in. Most of them ran through at least half of it, but by the end of it, we only had like 11 participants due to just the constraints of running a study during Christmas, during uni leave period. So guys were back in their hometowns, and we just couldn't really keep 20 guys within the participant pool. So that's what we got in terms of the sample size that we had. And so we naturally had to think about, okay, how are we going to do this in the chest? We decided that we wanted to kind of investigate it within the triceps as well. So there were other muscle groups that were assessed, like the anterior delt and the triceps. But the main concern for us was always the chest. So we used a Smith machine where we basically put a mechanical stop at the end where it was detachable whenever you needed it to, and set it in such a way where we randomized the participants' limbs to one end being on full ROM and one side being partial ROM. And so we just basically randomized them between left and right arm, regardless of whether they were right or left dominant. Most of our participants were right dominant, so we had to kind of randomize them fairly. And then, yeah, we just kind of ran the study through an 8-week trial. We wanted it to be longer, frankly. We actually wanted it to run somewhere like 16 weeks. But again, being in the middle of Christmas and all that, that was just not doable. So we had to cut it short by quite a bit. And we basically ran it by 8 weeks. And that was just the general setup of the entire study. We had to blind ourselves. So we had an ultrasound practitioner that could basically do the entire screening process for all the limbs because they were significantly more experienced than us. So we had to find a way to kind of align that up so that they could go to the hospital, which was quite a far distance away, so that they could actually get their screening done. And then we would come back to the lab, use our isokinetic device. We would test their 1RM and then run them through the program later on.
So it sounds like what you did was you ran them through a program where they trained a single arm chest press
Yes.
on the Smith machine. I'm wondering, what were the participants like in terms of sex and training experience?
Right. So we chose specifically untrained males purely because it's again exploratory. Like we wanted to see like if in a group of individuals who could see results, they were probably going to be the most likely to get the results that we wanted. We didn't recruit any females because we just didn't want to confound the data, and our pool of participants were fairly small. And in Asia, most, at least it's changing right now, but most uni students, you don't get a lot of female participants who wants to come in to run studies like this. So it was just much easier out of convenience to get males who are untrained uni students to come in and train with us at least for a period of time. We initially toyed with the idea of getting trained participants to really make it more reliable, like something that's ecologically more valid to people who have been training, like your listeners. But it was just incredibly difficult to get anybody to be like, look, for the next 8 weeks, just don't train your chest. For the next 16 weeks, don't train your chest. Don't do anything related to the chest, and just train with us, and we will give you a leg program. It was just incredibly difficult. So we wound up defaulting to just getting untrained participants.
That makes sense. And what kind of volume did they train their chest with based on the program you gave them?
It was 3 sets per session, twice a week for the first 4 weeks, and then we scaled it up to 4 sets per session for twice a week in the last 4 weeks. So so we had 8 weeks where the first 4 weeks it was basically 6 sets per week, and then in the later half of the program they had basically 8 sets per week, and we just basically applied progressive overload per usual, where we follow the ACSM guidelines, where they could hit the threshold that we needed it, and they could hit the top end of the rep range consistently, we would up the load. And if they couldn't, we would just back them off.
So was the intent for them to train to failure?
Yes. So we wrote that as muscular failure, and most of them at that point when they pushed, you literally couldn't get another rep out of them. Primarily because we kind of figured that most of them, because they're untrained, their ability to coordinate perfectly probably wasn't as close to true muscular failure as you would guess, but that it was muscular failure for them when the technique started to break down.
That makes sense. And then there's the added benefit that the Smith machine is helpful for the arm path because it keeps it the same, and a chest press in general is not the most technical of exercises.
Yeah. So we wanted to use we thought of the idea of using like a dumbbell where you had a greater range of motion for the full range group, because you can kind of arc the arm across right fully. But it was just so technically demanding, and we wanted to limit as many confounders as possible. So we eventually just defaulted to the Smith machine, which you could technically argue that, look, it's not really full ROM because you're not getting full shortened position, right? But it is as full as you can get when it came to a bench press.
Which is an interesting point to bring up, because you mentioned the shortened position, but since you were studying lengthened partials, obviously with the bar in the way, you also don't get a full lengthened range of motion for everyone for that reason.
So we basically tested their ranges of motion initially when we were screening them to just get the bar as low as you can go, to the point where it would touch the mid part of the sternum. And just from there, we can kind of say that, look, this is probably the most lengthened you're going to get into. Of course, you could argue that some people will be a little bit more hypermobile, therefore, in that joint, they could have gotten a little bit more. But because this was mostly exploratory, we didn't really dig into that any further. And we were like, look, as of right now, this might be what we could work with first. And if there were ever any future studies that could be run, this is something that we could consider.
That makes sense. And in the end, the fact that they were untrained also was in your favor, because on such low volume, it's much more likely that untrained individuals will see significant enough hypertrophy to
That's
be
right.
caught by your methods. That makes perfect
That's right.
sense.
That's right.
And when you ran the study, what were the conclusions?
So I'll go straight to the conclusion, in the sense that we were quite underwhelmed, in the sense that the initial hypothesis was that, based on all previous research that has been published, we hypothesized that we would see a benefit in terms of lengthened partials, in terms of the lengthened partial group, and that the full ROM group would probably be slightly less It's not going to be like huge difference, but we would detect a significance in terms of lengthened partial group in the lengthened partial group. But by the conclusion, we saw that look, there was because we didn't find any significant findings. We couldn't really we couldn't really look into it and say that look, the lengthened partial group was in fact better than the full ROM group. But that could just be because our sample size was also very, very small, so it's significantly more underpowered. We just couldn't detect it sufficiently. But I'll just give you a hint. With the full paper that we are sending in for review, even then with I think we have something like 20 odd participants, we still didn't really detect any significant differences between conditions. So by the end, we were like, okay, this is strange. Why would that be the case? Which then, if you looked at the full paper, there is a section that we kind of analyzed the biomechanics of a bench press, which then made sense to us why, or at least from a rationale from a biomechanics perspective, why it might be that the chest didn't quote unquote seem to benefit from lengthened partial training compared to full ROM.
Can you explain more about that?
So typically, whenever we're thinking about like the triceps or a bicep, especially when you're thinking of like a Bayesian curl, you would think that you're putting the long head of the muscle at higher resistance at long muscle length. And that's primarily where you see the real benefits of it. But when you're comparing that to like a bench press, the biomechanics of a bench press is already pretty lengthened bias. Like you couldn't get any more lengthened bias than a bench press in of itself if you really think about it. Like if you do a pec fly, most guys would fail right at the bottom end of the rep range, the reps itself, just because that's where your muscles are fully stretched out the most. Even when it came to a Bayesian curl, you'll notice that you're failing right at the bottom of the rep. Very rarely are you going to get into a point where you're failing towards the middle of the end range. So when you look at the Smith machine bench press and we came down, a full ROM setup versus a lengthened bias setup is pretty much the same thing, which goes to the point that look, for the chest, it's not because longer muscle lengths don't benefit the chest. It's more a case of the fact that the exercise itself is already lengthened bias, and any more lengthened bias exposure doesn't necessarily get us more growth. And this is something that when I was reading to Dorian's paper on, I think, isometrics on the quads, the rec fem, he did an isometric condition and a dynamic condition. And he found similar growth. And this is where he posited that it could be a ceiling effect that you're observing, which is what we kind of guessed as well, that you probably, after a certain threshold has been met, any more exposure towards lengthened position exposure probably isn't getting you more. And this goes to the point of, if you really think about it from a more big picture perspective, like more doesn't always equate to better gains. There is a ceiling effect, just like there's a diminishing return. We just do not know where that point is. And this seems to be elaborative of that point of like, look, once you hit that cap, that's basically as much lengthened exposure as you need to elicit the gains that you want to get.
Yes, that makes sense, and it's something that in practice, some people have brought up as well, and I've noticed too. For example, the first person that I heard talk about this was Steve Hall, whose podcast you were on recently, and he said that on some exercises he just didn't find much of a benefit. For example, RDLs and squats, because they are already quite that wasn't the reason that he argued, but in the context of what you said, if you think about it, well, they are already hard in the lengthened position, so how much more benefit would you get for simply keeping the range of motion to the lengthened position? And I found that to be true in my training as well. So that is a reasonable train of thought in my view.
Yeah. I'm just curious, even on your end, do you have Bayesian curl in your program?
Yes. Well, not at the moment, but I've done them plenty, yes.
Okay. So just out of curiosity, did you come to a point where you set it at a extremely lengthened bias position where you have basically your arm kind of tilted all the way up and trying to increase as much exposure to the lengthened position as possible? Have you had that set up before?
Yes.
Were you able to push yourself as close to muscular failure as you would had you lowered the cable position to something that's a little bit more mid-range bias? Did you find that to be a case? Is my question coming across? Does that make sense? in the sense that where you have one comparison where you are very lengthened biased and one that's slightly less lengthened biased, were you able to get to the same point of muscular failure in both conditions, or do you find that when you set it up in a less lengthened biased position, that you could push yourself closer to failure? Did you notice that?
I would say that I am going to answer the question with my experience of failing in the lengthened partial range of motion versus failing on exercises that are less heavy on the lengthened bias. I have noticed that when an exercise is very basically as lengthened bias as I can make it based on my biomechanics, the failure point always comes quite unexpectedly, quite suddenly, where all of a sudden, for example, on a Bayesian curl, I would try to start the rep, and I would think, I mean, it's by that point, the set is genuinely hard, but I'm thinking, oh, okay, I'm gonna get down and do another one, and then I just can't move my arm anymore. I fail. So, from if that is what you're talking about, then I would say that yes, I experienced that the fact that I get to failure sooner than I would, because to me it comes as unexpected. I perceive that based on my velocity, I should be able to get more repetitions, but I don't, unless I try to compensate.
Yeah, so the reason why I brought that up was because there was a paper by Larson that compared the Bayesian curl in a very lengthened position compared to another one that's a little bit more neutral. And they didn't find a significant difference between both conditions. And one of the things that he wrote in the discussion, that was written in the discussion by the author, was that it could be that putting a muscle in a very lengthened position actually limits your ability to push yourself close enough to failure, muscular failure. And that could be the reason why you're not seeing a big difference between the two conditions. Because had you put it in a very lengthened position and gotten to the same point or same degree of effort of muscular failure, similar to something that's slightly less lengthened bias, you could say that the lengthened position could be more beneficial than the neutral position, right? But that rarely is the case, which is what you just explained, that you typically find it to happen suddenly, and you're like, oh, okay, that's fail. But if I pressed you on it, gun to your head, could you continue doing, let's say, like a bicep curl with a different exercise? I'm pretty sure you could. And that's where it comes to the point where, in my mind, it's like, look, if I put it in a very, very lengthened position and I can't push my effort as high just because of the ability to generate force due to leverages, at that point, I'm not really gaining much. Yes, I've approached failure within this exercise, but the muscle itself hasn't actually approached failure yet. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and it sounds reasonable to me to believe that, because if we think about it, the extremes of the range of motion, the lengthened position and the shortened position, are the positions where the muscles are weakest, and then it's in the mid range that they are strongest. So it seems reasonable, because I'm thinking, well, if we are really making the lengthened position as extreme as we possibly can, we're putting the muscle in a position where it's weaker, and as a result of being weaker, then it might not be able to achieve failure as it would in a more advantageous position. So then that becomes a confounding factor, in the sense that, okay, if now we can't reach we can get as close to failure, we might not be able to get the same gains as if we were able to. And then, even if lengthened partials are more beneficial than full ROM is more beneficial because you can push closer to failure. So that it's almost like the two come out in the wash when
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
when you're making a comparison in a study.
exactly that. That's basically where I'm also thinking of. Like nowadays, whenever I'm reading the papers, and that's part of the reason why when you look at situations where they put it in a full program, like what you see Milo Wolf did with the triceps and the biceps, you didn't really see a significant difference between the two conditions because at some point it gets washed out and muddied by everything else. And we realize you can say that, look, putting more length and exposure still gets you better gains, but it's such a fractional amount, it's almost undetectable. Does that mean that's useless? I don't think that's the case. I just think that if you are trying to maximize your gains, you're going to have to consider all this variable inside first before just jumping the gun and saying that, look, lengthen bias training is definitely the only thing that we should be considering about.
Absolutely. And also, I think that lengthen partial range of motion has been a relatively recent topic of interest in the research world. But if you speak to researchers who are involved in this area, they will also make a point of saying, look, the range of motion is one of the variables that we can manipulate, but it's not as important for hypertrophy as the focus on it might lead people to believe.
Yep, yep. And I think that just the same way as you're putting it right now, because that's very succinct, like people don't, I think that there's a lack of realization that studies are meant to tease out one particular variable. And I've had to explain this many, many times because research is not meant to tell you the answers. And I think that most of your audience would have already understood this, that you're not supposed to take a paper and run with it, like as though that's the take it dogmatically, because that runs counter to the spirit of what science is. But the entire point is to determine that this variable does exist. The question is how you apply it is an entirely separate conversation in the context of the entire framework of how you train. I would typically approach this from a perspective of what's the principle that we can derive. And I would still hold the stance right now that putting muscles at longer muscle lengths generally would produce better growth than putting muscles in shorter muscle lengths. But there are some considerations to have, like what exercises are we doing? Does this muscle already have something that's fairly lengthened bias? And if you do, I don't think it's something that we have to be overly worried about. And can you get close enough to failure with adequate amount of volume per week that allows you to sustain this effort over a long period of time?
That makes sense. Before we move into, I have a question on how you personally apply length and bias to your training and your clients' training. But I want to pause on the conclusions because you mentioned that you also took a look at what was happening in the triceps and in the anterior delts. Were there any differences compared to what happened with the chest?
For the anterior delt, not so much, but across all the measures, we didn't really see any significant difference. Now, the one thing that we did notice was that in the triceps, we did see slightly better growth in the full ROM condition, which if you think about it, again, from a biomechanics perspective, it made a lot of sense because the full ROM group was really the only group that had the tricep really work extra hard to get into the lockout position. So it made sense that in the full ROM group, you would see better gains in the triceps, even though it didn't reach a point of significance. So yeah, that was the only one that we're like looking at it like, yeah, that pretty much explains why the full ROM group could potentially in the long term be more beneficial for some folks, especially if you're short on time. And you're like, look, I don't really have time to kind of hit every small muscle group that I have. Maybe doing full ROM could be better for you if that's something that you have to consider.
I thought of that immediately, being short on time, because I was thinking, well, the triceps are only indirectly trained on the bench press. So if you had the time to do direct volume for triceps, I suspect that some lengthened partial work would be more beneficial than only focusing on full range of motion, or even if you focus on full range of motion, having a bias towards spending time at long muscle length would be beneficial. But in the context of somebody who only has so long to train and maybe they can only do full body sessions 2 or 3 times a week, then going to the full range of motion might benefit the triceps a little bit more than not.
Yep. I would probably view it in the sense that like indirect training, where if you look at indirect volumes that you can count, fractional volumes that you can count, similar to what the Palin paper did in terms of muscle groups that's involved. This is how you could apply that finding into this case, where if you're doing a lengthened partial bias bench press, it's probably counted to me one full set of chest, but there's literally zero in triceps or minimal, and I would just count it as zero, versus a full range of motion bench press, which I could count the tricep as half a set.
Makes sense. So my question on practical applications is this: how did this study change the way that you were applying lengthened partials to your training personally and to your clients, if it changed it in any way?
I think it didn't so much as change as it did modify the way that I kind of looked at variables, because for a long time we were thinking that, look, if you can't see growth, you probably want to do a lot of lengthened bias trainings, regardless of how the exercises was constructed. And from this, it came to a point where I was kind of looking at exercises more in the case of like, does this exercise already have lengthened exposure involved? Like a preacher curl is pretty lengthened bias, a pretty lengthened bias bicep exercise. At that point, doing purely lengthened bias work there may not necessarily be beneficial. Even if it is, it's probably too trivial for you to worry about. And the next question I naturally will ask was, could you get close enough to muscular failure? Like true muscular failure to the point where you literally could not contract anymore. Like that were considerations from an exercise perspective. The other thing that we kind of considered was that I had this conversation with Mike from Revive as well, that injury risks or tendon health could be something that we had to kind of look into more further. We didn't really dig into a lot of that in the discussion, but it was definitely something that was at the back of our mind, and we did consider it because the tendon is an area of the muscle that doesn't really get much blood supply, which meant that recovery would definitely be a lot slower. And we find, at least in my experience anecdotally, I find that whenever you put a lot of lengthened exposure exercises, it does mess up the tendons a little bit. Even in myself, where I did at one point a lot of lengthened bias chest work, I never had shoulder joint, shoulder pains to the point where it was uncomfortable. But when I did a lot of lengthened exposed chest work, it started creeping up. And I found this in my quads. I found this in my triceps. I found this to a small degree in my biceps whenever I did lengthened bias preacher curls. So this came to a point where like, look, yes, I want to put muscles in a more lengthened bias position. But if it comes at the expense of recovery and it shortens either my mesocycle because I had to take more frequent deloads or I had to back off on progression just because I couldn't push myself close enough to muscular failure, I think that you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you're kind of losing it at the end of the day because you're coming back to square one. So it came to a point where we're like, look, just like everything else, it's really a dose that you want to apply, but over application is a problem because it limits your ability to sustainably train yourself over the long term and push yourself close enough to muscular failure, which arguably is the bigger variable that you should be worried about first.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have found that anecdotally different body parts respond differently, or what I mean by that is they can take more or less exposure to lengthened partials. For example, my right shoulder personally is quite sensitive, especially my rotator cuff. I found in the past that if I had a lot of heavily lengthened bicep exercises, I would get pain. And then as soon as I took those out, as I reduced the dose, the pain would go away or be relieved. So I know that was the variable that made the difference, because the pain also began once I introduced the extra lengthened partials. And then I have body parts where I have no particular issue, where I can go to town with lengthened partials. Relatively speaking, I don't only train with lengthened partials, but it doesn't affect me as much. And I've noticed it with my clients as well. There are some body parts that have no issues, and some body parts where the exposure needs to be more controlled. So it sounds to me like what you're saying and what you gathered from the evidence that you've collected with this study and taking a broader look at the literature as well, is that lengthened partials can be beneficial, and it seems like your view is they are possibly more beneficial than full ROM, as long as the dose is controlled. And also we were talking about how not only the dose in terms of volume is important, but the dose in terms of how lengthened partials the exercise is, in the sense that if it is too lengthened partials, it could get to the point where it might not be as beneficial anymore.
Yeah. So I asked this question in the Bali workshop that we had with Brandon, and I'm just curious on your take. Do you do dumbbell skull crushes?
Yes.
Do you still have them in your program?
Not at the moment, but as of 3 weeks ago, I did, yes.
Okay. Why did you take them out initially?
Well, it was because my coach said so in that case.
Okay, all right. So the reason why I asked is because a dumbbell skull crusher, depending on how you set up, can be quite lengthened bias. It's pretty lengthened bias for the triceps, right? And we asked this in the workshop the other day, and we had 3 guys who raised their, Steve included, who still had skull crushers involved in their program. But when I asked who has done it and who has done it but stopped, a large degree of replies that I got for why they stopped was the fact that they felt discomfort in the elbow tendon, the tricep tendon on the way down. And just at the top of my head, I think there were like 7, maybe 6, maybe 7 guys who stopped doing tricep skull crushers versus 3 or 4 guys who continued doing skull crushers within their program. And to me, this sounds like, look, because injury is quite genetically driven. Like some guys just get injured more frequently than other people. Like some probably on different areas of the muscle. Some people are just more prone to injuries and whatnot. And so this came to kind of spark an idea in my mind that it might just be the case that for some guys, being in more lengthened bias training probably doesn't kill them as much as, let's say, for me. So it might be the case that your anecdote, your experience isn't completely ridiculous. In the sense that you probably in this joint, your joint just doesn't take to lengthen exposure as well as some other. Like for me, I can't do dumbbell skull crushes to save my life because my elbows hurt a lot. And most injuries that you see, even among big lifters, are rarely ever directly the muscle itself that gets injured, but rather the tendon itself that ruptures and tears. So this really comes to a point to me that, look, you can introduce lengthened exposure work, and not everybody's going to respond the same purely because recoverability is a major factor here. So to me, it's more like, look, Nikia still can dumbbell skull crush pretty comfortably, but Kevin doesn't seem to be able to do it. Why is that? Probably because recoverability is being capped. So even though it's a very lengthened bias exercise, it's just not suitable for this guy because he's not being able to recover, and then limits his ability to put in more intensity, put in more volume into his training, which could get him more growth than just a lengthened bias exercise in of itself. Does that make sense?
It does. And what's coming up for me is the thought that the way I view lengthened partials or biasing an exercise towards the lengthened position is you're doing a different exercise. Yes, we're talking about the same exercise. We're talking about a skull crusher. But if you are heavily biasing one part of the range of motion, your muscle doesn't know whether you're doing a skull crusher, whether you're doing a close grip push-up. It can only perceive tension. So when the tension changes, the perception on the muscle changes. So to me, any change in tension is a change in exercise. So if any change in what the muscle might perceive is a change in exercise. So if we're manipulating the resistance profile to make it more lengthened biased, to me, it's almost like we're changing from a dumbbell skull crusher to a tricep pushdown. So just like from a broad perspective, some exercises suit some people better than others. So do lengthened biased exercises versus less lengthened biased exercises, the way I see it.
Yeah, that's actually a very, very cool way of looking at it. Yeah, I would definitely, I totally get where you're.
And for example, that brings up the importance of individualizing training to the person, because something that's interesting about me is that all of my joints are hypermobile, not to an extreme extent, and I don't have any related condition like POTS or MCAS, but my elbows and my knees and everything about them. My elbows and my knees go in weird positions. I get at very extreme ranges of motion. And for me, a lot of lengthened partial exposure isn't necessarily beneficial if I don't pair it with strength and stability work, because if for me a lengthened partial or a lengthened biased exercise doesn't necessarily just involve the muscle. If I don't pay enough attention, I will go into a point where my joint is being pulled in a position where it's not supposed to go. So if I don't have the strength and stability to keep, for example, my shoulder in position, and only get my delts, my rear delts, for example, if I'm doing a real delt exercise in a lengthened range, I exceed that range where my muscles are in control, and I get to a point where my joint is just being pulled back by the cable, for example, and I can get there, but it's not necessarily beneficial for my recovery because it can result in pain if I repeat that long term.
Yeah, so that's definitely something to kind of consider, because a lot of guys are looking at, when I say range of motion, I also have to make sure that I clarify that I'm talking about range of motion within that joint. A lot of people do this thing where they're looking at an exercise from a very external perspective rather than looking at the exercise from the perspective of that joint and that muscle. It's the equivalent of going into an RDL and trying to get the bar to touch the floor. The whole point of that exercise is to put the hamstring at a longer muscle length. And if you're getting more range, but it's not coming from the hips itself, or it takes it to the point where it's uncomfortable for the hips, to the point where you're under recovery or you're messing up the joint, you're not really exposing the muscle to more tension, you're just causing more disruption. And that's where a very, very cool principle by RTS that's teaching this is basically what you have, what you own, and what you can tolerate. Which is, what does your joint have? What range of motion do you own? And how much can you tolerate? Which is a very, very cool way of putting things together, because a lot of people don't have that range, but they're forcefully trying to get into it and trying to find ownership of it when they don't have it, which is causing them to tolerate less dose of training that they could be doing, and inevitably running into the problems like you're saying, that I'm getting into pain and injuries in the long term, which limits my ability to train.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that I think about a lot, and the way I conceptualize this principle is that more isn't better, enough is enough, because I have a tendency, I'm really passionate about hypertrophy, and I used to have a tendency to want to maximize everything. Well, more volume seems to be more beneficial, so let's do more volume. Oh, lengthened partials and training a longer muscle length seems to be more beneficial, so let's do a ton of that then. And you run into problems because you might be able to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can do it long term and that it will benefit you long term. And it also, for me, what the conversation goes is, I also think about longevity. I'm thinking now much more about, okay, I can do this short term, but how does that set me up for future training phases? If it's going to be a short-term effort that has beneficial effects, I'll do it. But if it has the potential to lead to injury or pain that then prevents me from training more effectively, then I am much less likely to do it, even if technically from a theoretical perspective it seems to be beneficial.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that where I think that every lifter has at least come to a point where they're doing too much at one go. This is where the dreamer bulk comes in, where everybody's like, look, if I just ate 2 whole pizzas a day and 4 cheeseburgers and just get as stupid massive as possible, I'm going to get as much muscle mass as possible. And then we did it and we're like, oh no, shit, that doesn't work. And I did it in a way where I definitely had the dreamer bulk phase. I even had to a point where volume, because we are still pretty confident that high volumes get you better gains. But it came to a point where I was doing the ramping system, where I would add sets as week goes on, just like what RP used to do. And it came to a point where it was so ridiculous. I was doing something like 8 sets of leg press per day. And I wasn't even, like, honestly looking back, I can't even tell you whether I was close enough to failure. At that heat of the moment, it did feel like that it was close to failure. But any guy who knows their salt would be able to tell you that 8 sets of leg press and like full depth leg press is gonna kill you, and that's gonna limit your ability to do other things that allows you to potentially grow more. And I think that the lengthened partial stuff is just the same rabbit hole that we are going down again, and it's just by nature of us trying to chase for more gains. It's really a thing of, I want to see how much potential I can get, and this could be the key that unlocks my new gains. And the more I read, the less I'm confident that any one variable is going to be the make or break of anything. And I'm pretty sure that you're going to agree on this, where if you just rely on that one variable, whether it's training to failure, whether it's volume, whether it's lengthened partials, and you just use that one variable and say that, look, this is the end all be all, you're going to basically tunnel vision yourself into a scenario where in retrospect, you're going to be like, look, had I not done this, I could have progressed a little bit further or a little bit faster.
Yeah, that's reasonable to me. And I realize that sometimes in this conversation, this seems to be completely out of left field, but it just follows on from what we've been talking about. I realize in this conversation at points, I might have made it sound like I was saying lengthened partials and then biasing long muscle lengths as though they are the same thing when they aren't. So if I'm talking about biasing long muscle lengths, this could be within the context of doing the full range of motion. We're just placing the muscle in a position where it's harder in the lengthened range. And I wanted to bring that up because this is a spectrum, because we could do lengthened partials only range of motion, and we could also place the muscle in the most lengthened bias position possible, and this would be the extreme. But then also there are all of these other points before we get to that extreme where we could just do lengthened partials but not have such a strong bias towards the lengthened position. We could do full range of motion, but try to have a stronger bias towards the lengthened position. And ultimately, it seems like if we can think of it as a spectrum and find our sweet spot on the spectrum for the specific person and the specific muscle involved, that might be more beneficial than just try to maximize everything for the sake of placing the muscle in the under the most lengthened, or train at the longest length possible for the longest period of time possible.
Yeah, I think the general principle to take away is that you don't have to exclusively training at long muscle lengths only, like lengthened partials would in your entire program. Is probably not the wisest thing you can do, especially not for everyone. But the principle that you can take away is probably in the fact that putting muscles at relatively long muscle lengths are probably better than putting muscles at relatively short muscle lengths. And at least that's what I would say.
Same. And I'm curious, Kevin, this might be a fun question to answer. I'm curious about which common mistakes you think or you see people make when it comes to applying this concept of training at long muscle length and doing lengthened partials. We've mentioned a couple already, where the tendency, for example, to try to maximize everything to the at the expense of the ability to recover. Another one is placing the muscle in such an extreme lengthened bias that now the ability to produce force is limited, and actually you don't get as much of a stimulus as you could. Can you think of others that you've encountered or that you made yourself in terms of mistakes?
I think that the main one I see, and I've already mentioned it, is just looking at exercises from an external perspective. I can't say I've seen of mistakes in general, because most guys instinctively would know that changing your entire program into a lengthened partial workout doesn't seem to be very beneficial. But I think that the main thing that I see people do when they try to apply this into their training program is that they're applying in the wrong places, like trying to do lengthened partials to me in a leg press that's like really, really, really heavy, like trying to keep the load the same, but doing lengthened partial work there. I just don't think you can do it that well. You're definitely going to have to back off on this. Or the fact that they're looking at it from a perspective of an external view, where they're looking at more range as far as the bar can travel, that is considered lengthened partial, when the reality is that you have to look at what the muscle action is and what the joint is doing. That's really the main takeaway that I can see. So like with the dumbbell lateral raise, where people are going all the way, thinking that this is probably where you want to get to in terms of dumbbell lateral raise, to me, is more range isn't always better, like you said. It's about what you're doing within that range and whether you're taking the muscles as close to failure within that range. That's really where I'm seeing most of it.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it resonates with me as well. I'm wondering, how do you personally currently use lengthened partials in your own training? Are you doing any?
Yeah, so I still do apply lengthened partial work into a lot of my programs, not everything. Primarily in areas where you have weaker muscles, like we are assuming that there's no recoverability issues, like you can recover just fine. I would use it in areas where you have weaker muscle groups, in muscle groups where the exercise itself is fairly short and biased, things like your lats, things like your calves, where you have a mechanical advantage in most cases. So these are usually the areas that I'm looking at. So things like my calves, I usually would take it to failure and beyond, where I would fail in the lengthened position, similar to my lats, where I would probably want to fail closer in the lengthened position than in the shortened position. And for muscle groups like my chest, let's say I find that I'm struggling to see growth. If let's say I rather, instead of doing it in like a bench press, I would probably apply in things like a pec fly, where the absolute load is much smaller, that I can probably end with some lengthened partial work, which will probably, because it's a pretty lengthened bias exercise in of itself, I might get like a rep or maybe two and then call it, and basically just increase slightly more lengthened exposure towards it. But for things that are already fairly lengthened biased, or you have an area where recoverability is an issue, like for me, my triceps are one of them. In my cable overhead tricep extensions, I would probably never do lengthened bias work. In my press downs, I don't do it purely from a recoverability perspective. I also don't see a reason for me to continuously do lengthened exposure work because my triceps are fairly, from my physique perspective, it's fairly big. So that's not something that I'm considering. So similar to my biceps, it's also not something that I'm considering. But wherever I find that these are lagging muscle groups, this is just one lever that I can probably pull, potentially to give me that 1% more, provided I'm not recovering any poorer.
Interesting. And when it comes to programming for your clients, if recoverability is not an issue, there is no issue with pain or injury when it comes to performing lengthened partials or training muscles at longer muscle lengths. And also where the exercise is not a concern. For example, it's not already an exercise like the chest press, as we were talking about, where it might not be that beneficial to do lengthened partials. What are some factors that would make you decide not to program lengthened partials for somebody, if there are any?
So I would typically, so I have to kind of backtrack a little bit. I would actually redefine the way that I define full ROM. And that's something that I have to take into consideration, because to me, full ROM would be where I can complete a rep at least clearing like arbitrary number, 50 to 60% of the lengthened position. At least that's what I would define full ROM as. So long as you can clear 50, 60% of the range of motion, I would still consider that as a full rep that can be done. So that's what my definition of full ROM would be. Now, to answer your question of how I apply it to somebody who's completely, let's say this person is completely brand new, I'm assuming this guy has no prior lifting experience, maybe like a year or two of lifting experience. I would probably just apply that definition of full ROM and tell them that, look, I need to train to this degree of full ROM and just call it, and just focus on being able to take muscles close enough to failure. Now, where I will apply lengthened bias work or lengthened partials would be when you've already checked off these boxes. Then will I be like, okay, look, this muscle group seems to be lagging a little bit, or it might be a concern for you, like you want to potentially pull that 1% dial, and you've already checked off the volume, you're consistently training, we can see from your videos that you're close enough to failure. Now we can potentially say that, look, let's try dosing it with one or two exercises that are lengthened partial. So let's say like cross-body delt raise that just raises up to like the lengthened position. Maybe a cable delt raise that only biases the lengthened position. So things like this could be considered later on. Then I would try for maybe like a mesocycle or two, just to hear what your recoverability is like. Like, do you have any issues trying to progress? Do you have any issues in the joints itself? Do you feel pain? If there's no such report, we could potentially add the volume if you find that, look, I'm not progressing as well, I'm not seeing as much progression, or we could potentially just add an additional day with more lengthened bias work. Those are probably considerations that I would start with first. But if you don't really have full control over the full range of motion or the ability to take sets close enough to failure, I would say that lengthened bias work would kind of warp that that perception of where you're supposed to be failing. And I've done this mistake before, where especially like a good example would be like a Bayesian curl, where they hit this immediate dead stop where they're unable to progress, and because they think that, oh, I can't contract this because my muscles are at such a mechanical disadvantage, I don't have leverage to curl. That's what failure is like. And I've now taught this person that that's what failure means, when that's not truly the case. And if you've been in the gym long enough and seen guys actually fail, it's much grindier, a lot harder than it looks. And that kind of failing point at, like, let's say a Bayesian curl, isn't really what I'm talking about. So that lack of ability to grind your sets, I find that that's probably gonna kind of kneecap that and kind of handicap their growth a lot more. So I find that in these kind of scenarios, I don't really want to put them in the kind of position that might jeopardize their career in the long term, purely because they have a distorted worldview of what muscular is like. Because in my head, I'm thinking of one thing because I have my experience, but in his head, because this person has completely, like a complete novice in terms of training, so their perception is like, oh, if Kevin got to this kind of results, and this is what he meant by failure, this must be the reason. and then inevitably it just hurts their self-efficacy in the long term, and they just don't push themselves as hard because that's what they think pushing themselves is.
That's a really good point. It makes me think of when lengthened partials first became popular, and there were some people that were even suggesting that the shortened range was no longer useful at all. And at the time, I disagreed, and I still do, because I find applications for for exercises that are shortened bias or that have where you do go through the shortened range, because it teaches people, for example, you mentioned teaching people what true failure feels like. Training exercises that are shortened, more shortened bias, for me, is a good teaching tool for people to understand what mind muscle connection is. Because if we take the biceps, I suspect that you might agree with this. I find that if you do a shortened bias curl, people tend to perceive the biceps working and get a bigger pump than when they're doing purely lengthened partial work. So if somebody is struggling to feel a muscle because maybe they're less experienced in the example that you brought up, I find that using full range of motion and using more shortened bias exercises is really helpful because they feel that contraction really strongly and they associate that with mind muscle connection, and that does increase their ability to perceive the muscle throughout the range of motion.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I definitely treat. I'm assuming that you're not saying that you're putting majority of your program into like short and bias exercises. Yeah, like I'm pretty sure that you're fairly well read, so you're probably using this in a way where you can adequately push them close enough to failure with sufficient volume and just have a few exercises in the more shortened bias position, like you said. And for me, I would probably do just the same thing, where I do see value in the middle to short range bias exercises, just like you said, just for being able to push them close enough to failure and being able to kind of showcase to them that, look, sustainability wise, this is probably something more sustainable than just purely lengthened bias works. And if we can add this in together with your lengthened bias work, you can get more volume in the long run than just doing purely lengthened bias work. The counter argument that I can think of that people might bring up would be that, look, is the point to do more volume or is the point to grow? And my rebuttal to that typically would be like, look, the point is to be able to sustainably do this. If I put so much lengthened bias work, the first thing that's going to go is not because I get to do less. It's more of a fact that I probably cannot sustain this effort long term. I cannot push myself close enough to failure. So therefore, I'm going to go less. So if I'm a gambling man, I would probably gamble on the person who could push themselves closer to failure, even if I wound up doing the 20-30% more volume than the guy who's doing purely lengthened bias work just from a recoverability standpoint.
Yes, that makes sense to me. And I should clarify, I agree with what you said in the sense of how to use the shortened bias or mid-range biased work. And I wanted to clarify that I do not program shortened partials at this moment in time. I am mainly talking about biasing a certain part of the range of motion within the context of full range of motion.
Yep. I would definitely agree the way they're just doing this, because a teaching tool like this is probably something that's invaluable, especially to somebody who's fairly brand new. They can't really tell what muscles are being worked. Not to say that the mind muscle connection is super ultra critical or the pump is super ultra critical, but I do see value in proxies like this, similar to soreness and just about everything else. I don't think in of itself they tell you anything about hypertrophy, but I do see value in them. And I think that Helms has a paper that he's kind of like working on that basically is investigating on whether proxies like this do tell you anything about hypertrophy. Now, my hypothesis is that it does, although not very strongly, but I would be hard pressed. I would be very, very perplexed if they don't tell you anything at all.
Would agree with that. I actually interviewed Derek Van Every, who had a paper come out on the pump, and so my view is that it doesn't necessarily lead to growth, but I don't think it's not valuable, because the way I see it is these proxies, like having mind muscle connection and feeling the pump, especially, to me, For one, they motivate people because it's nice to feel a pump. It makes people feel
Yeah.
as though they have done work. And if you are motivated to train consistently, I think there's value in that. I also think there's value in the placebo effect because if you believe that you are making progress, you will push yourself hard to keep the progress coming. And as a result, you will make more progress. But I also think of it from the perspective of training quality. I think that if you perceive that you have more mind muscle connection and that you're getting a pump, ultimately you are, in my view, you must be doing something where you are placing your muscles under more tension. So the way you are performing the exercise is likely causing more tension to be perceived by the individual muscle fibers. And that is why you are getting that response. And ultimately, tension is what leads to hypertrophy. So if somebody asks me, hey, do you think that doing an exercise that looks perfect from the outside, but the person doesn't get a pump and they don't really have a mind muscle connection, is that exactly equivalent to getting a pump and having a strong mind muscle connection? My view is that not really, because the example that comes to mind is beginners don't really feel their muscles working. They're doing a chest press and they're like, oh, I just feel it in my arms, but not really in my pecs. Well, we know that biomechanically, if you didn't have pec muscles working, you wouldn't be able to do a chest press. So of course their muscles are working, but are they getting as much out of the set as they do when they're more advanced? I don't believe so. I think that what they're getting is the newbie gain phase. They are growing because they're newbies, and literally looking at a dumbbell will grow them. But is that individual set as effective if we take out the newbie gains benefit out? Is that as effective as when they have stronger mind muscle connection and a greater pump? My view is that it may not be quite the same.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up because I literally have a client who has been working with us for quite a while, made quite substantial amount of gains. Can't feel fuck all in his his muscle groups, like things like his chest, his back. Whenever you ask him, it's always his arms, his forearms, his delts, and I'm like, man, you can't feel shit. But the thing is this: if you look at him visually, you can see that muscle is being gained now. Just the same as you said, like if this person had better mind muscle connection, do you think that this person would have gained more? I would say yes. Purely from, if nothing else, is from an ability to really push the muscle close enough to failure before everything else fails first. Because if I only feel my arms and my arms are burning, the back is still maybe like 4, 5, 6 reps away from failure, but the arms are close to failure now. So the mind muscle connection is really more of a radar and diagnostic tool to be like, oh, okay, I'm really close to failure now. Now, biomechanically speaking, everything is still moving as intended. So we know that's part of the reason why he's still growing. The real issue here is probably that if I can't get a pump, I can get a strong mind muscle connection. Within session, I can't really tell whether I'm close enough to failure. And that's really where the problem is. So the way that I view all of this as a proxy is that these are all just proxies. You need a short, medium, and long-term proxy. And the problem with long-term proxies is that they take months to years. Like growth, I want to see visual growth. That's what I'm looking for. All of us are looking for at the end of the day. But I'm not going to do a program for like 12 months and then figure out, fuck, I'm in the wrong direction right now. And I have to change it. So we need something shorter, a diagnostic tool. So we use something more medium term. Things like strength progression. Am I progressing my strength? Am I able to recover between sessions? So we need weeks to months. But even then, I'm not going to wait weeks to months before I figure out whether I'm getting closer. So I'm breaking it down one more step and say that, look, within session short-term proxies, am I getting some of this feedback? Now, this is where a lot of people would disagree. And I think this is where a little bit of false dichotomy kind of comes in, where we're kind of looking at, does soreness matter? Oh, yes and no, it's not really predictive. But if you don't get any soreness at all, are you really getting close enough to failure? Like, are you really pushing yourself? Like, if you're never sore, like, I've never heard a bodybuilder who's successful who tells me that I've trained my entire 20 years, never actually gotten sore at all. Like, to me, at least from my experience, I don't think that really makes sense. A pump, like you said, if I cannot really feel a sense of pump, or I have no strong mind muscle connection, how do you really know that you're pushing yourself close enough to failure? So to me, these are just diagnostic tools. But again, they feed and I'm using that to extrapolate logic over the long term to see whether we're getting to where we're supposed to be. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and that's how I use them. I use these proxies as well, because as you say, we're not going to wait 6 months to find out if your program was effective. And the proxy that I consider most reliable is progressive overload, but
Yeah.
the more advanced you are, the slower it's going to be. So I'm not going to wait 3 months for you to add 1 rep to 1 set to say, oh yes, the program is clearly effective. So
Yeah.
that's when these other tools can come in. And what's the way I see it is, as long as you don't start believing that in order to have a productive workout, you must get a pump,
Yeah.
you must get sore, and you must get the best mind-muscle connection, then these tools are valuable. And I think that if you go to that extreme, it also, this is a thought I've just had, so it's really brand new. I'm just going to share it because I think it's interesting. I think it leads people to underestimate the positive benefits of a session and just a training program that runs fine. Like if you maybe you're not maybe you're not accusing the most amazing pumps of your life, but also you're not getting injured. You don't need to deload very frequently. Progressive overload is coming along. It's just, I don't know how to define it. It's an underwhelming, perhaps, about a program, because again, there are no extremes. You're not injured, and also you're not. It doesn't. You don't have to think about, like, you do it and it's going well and things are chugging along. It makes me wonder if when you focus on the extremes, so the most extreme pumps, the most extreme soreness, it can lead people to believe that these programs that run well, and there you go.
Freaks out at just about everything. I'm so sorry about that.
No worries. I was just saying, it makes me wonder if this chasing of extremes leads people to underestimate the benefits of a program that chugs along, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I definitely like. There's so many things that you said that are such good points, because I think that it goes back to, and I've been really reading a lot into critical thinking and things like imposter syndrome and whatnot, purely just because of things like logical fallacies like this. Because we like to believe that we are a lot more logical just because we are very evidence based, but it is surprisingly common for even the most intelligent people to fall for this kind of black or white mentality of saying that this doesn't matter, this does matter, and we're kind of just creating arbitrary lines drawn in the sand to kind of say that, look, this program works better than this just because of this particular variable. And just like what you said, I think that we shouldn't overvalue one particular variable, neither should we undervalue it completely. And the best thing that I've really stuck to when it comes to my coaching is more like all models are wrong, some models are just more useful than others. And that's a really good way of kind of looking at, look, whatever I say right now is just tentative. Like 5 years down the line, somebody's going to look back at this podcast and be like, man, Kevin's a fucking idiot. Like, he got everything wrong. And I'm like, yeah, probably did. But I would suspect that if we're following the red thread of truth and evidence, we're probably not going to be landing so far off left field from what we are already observing right now. Something has to be so remarkable in a study to basically overturn everything else in prior history. That would be very amazing to see.
I would agree with that. I think that with studies, with studies on lengthened partials and versus full ROM, for example, I believe that we can tease out how to apply these tools in a way that may be more effective depending on the person. I don't think we are necessarily overhauling the basic principles that will lead to hypertrophy.
Yeah. I think that we just don't know enough to be that confident. And something that I was listening to Dorian speak with Steve at one point was that the more you read, the more you feel like there's this black hole of knowledge that you cannot seem to get enough of. Like, the more you feed into it, the more you need. And I feel like I find myself to be in that case because after reading for so long, it just feels like you're never absolutely certain about the information that you have. There's a lot of uncertainty that's involved. And I think that in part scares us, But at the same time, because as human beings, we want certainty, we like comfort in knowing that we know what we think is the truth. Unfortunately, that's rarely ever the case, and so that creates camps. But I also think that that's something to be excited about. That, oh, look, there's something new that we get to learn. And when just like how when Dr. Wolf, when he released the paper on lengthened partials, and all these other papers by Cassiano, by Pedrosa, when this was put together, I'm like, wow, like when you think from a mechanistic perspective, I'm like, oh yeah, it's probably because there's more tension here. Therefore, we now have a better diagnostic tool to determine whether your program is sound or not. Does that make sense?
It does, and to your point that the more you read, the more you realize that we don't really understand enough. I agree. I have also found that even though we don't understand enough, the advantage that we have is that the human body seems to be surprisingly adaptable to a wide variety of training methods. So while of course I would like to know more, and it bothers me not to, because I've also recognized that it's because I am curious and because I am human, so I am driven by feelings. But when I think about it objectively, people grow from so many different training programs that it also gives me peace of mind that even if I don't know exactly why something works or what the most optimal approach is, there are a lot of ways to help people grow. So if I follow the thread of the evidence to the best of my ability and I tailor the program to the person in front of me, because everyone is different and everybody requires different approaches, then I am probably not going to stray too far away from optimal to the point where they're not going to see at least some degree of results that I have under my control. And the other thing that gives me peace of mind is that genetics play a greater role than some people might like to believe. And so I think, okay, if I follow the thread of the evidence to the best of my ability, I don't think I'm straying too far away from this person's genetic potential. And there are also factors that I simply cannot contend with, which is their own this genetic potential.
Yeah. So the way that I kind of look at this is I completely agree with everything you said. Just to make it very very clear with everybody, because and this is not to sound derogatory in any way, even though it might come off that way. But the one thing that we can be sure of is that people far less well read in the literature have gotten so much further in their physique, their strength, and everything encompassing the sport itself. And they've gotten far because they've covered the big rocks, and that's really the way that I want to take away from this. And we are looking at that 1% more. It doesn't mean that this 1% means nothing. It just means that this is a variable that you can pull later on if, let's say, you've covered the big rocks. And it's more of not just turning over stones, but every grain of sand that you can find. And like you said, for majority of folks, it's not to say that this doesn't matter, because we all like learning new things. We all find it. The reason why we went down this road is because we are trying to understand human physiology on a deeper level and appreciate it because it's pretty fucking cool. Science is pretty fucking cool, and that's all well and good. But we should never forget that it pays a lot more if you're trying to just maximize your physique just to train really fucking hard. Like you're really overwhelmed with information, which I have young guys coming in who are, especially with the age of TikTok and fast content and whatnot. And I sound so old for doing this because I get so jaded on things that I see on reels of TikTok. And man, there's just not enough information here for you to make these kind of claims. But I understand why it's that way. But it just creates this environment of information overload. And so the way that I tend to tell people that, look, the bros have it correct like 80% of the way already. They've gotten a lot of things wrong. But the one thing that they got correct is that you have to train really fucking hard. You have to apply progressive overload in some form or manner. You're going to have to be very consistent over the long term. Your nutrition has to be sound. And you have to make sure that you cover your sleep and recover time. Like, boom. Voila, that's like 85% of your game. But if this entire conversation nobody takes away anything else from the length and partial stuff, or the long muscle length thing, understanding that these variables are not going to take these big rocks. Thereafter, you can worry about, okay, maybe we should apply more lengthened bias stuff. Maybe doing more periodized programs are going to get you better results. Maybe higher volumes at certain phases might be beneficial than other specialization phases and whatnot. I think those conversations can come down the line once your big rocks are taken care of.
Yes, I would agree with that. And Kevin, I think that this conversation was really thought-provoking. I believe that my audience will love it. I had a blast talking to you. And now I would like to know where people can find you and connect with you if they want to work with you, so that I can put all of the links in the show notes.
So if you're ever based in Malaysia, you can always come by to our gym here in Bangsar, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where you can look at my gym's page, First Pace KL at Instagram, where you can see some of what our clients have done, some of what our amazing coaches have worked with. We're very, very proud of our community for what we've created. But if you're trying to work with me on a personal capacity, you can always look at my Instagram, Kevin Oo _WNBF Pro. I might change that in the future, I might not. Who knows? My Instagram is a complete cowboy. I upload things willy-nilly as and when I please. But yeah, you can look out for me on Instagram, and if you feel free, like with any questions, just drop me a DM. I might reply late because I'm usually not online, but that's usually where people can reach out to me.
Excellent. Kevin, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Dear listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in as always, and I will talk to you next time.